March 20th, 1981, Morumbi Stadium, Sao Paulo, Brazil. The dressing room didn't smell of victory. It smelled of damp concrete and the heavy metallic scent of a thunderstorm that refused to break. Outside, 100,000 people were waiting in the dark, waiting to see if Freddie Mercury would be brave enough to be loud in a country where being loud could get you disappeared. Earlier that evening, men in plain clothes had delivered a warning. Keep the performance simple. Do not encourage them. Do not give them ideas about freedom. Now Freddie sat in front of a cracked mirror, hands trembling, staring at his reflection. And Brian May stood in the doorway, waiting to see if his friend would choose silence or revolution. What happened next would become legendary, but in that moment, Freddie Mercury was just a man trying to decide if one voice could matter in a country where voices had been silenced for 17 years. The air inside the dressing room beneath the Morumbi Stadium in Sao Paulo did not smell of victory. It smelled of damp concrete, of mildew creeping through cracks in the walls, of the heavy metallic scent of a thunderstorm that had been threatening all day but refused to break, as if the sky itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen. Outside, 100,000 people were waiting in the dark. But they weren't just fans. They weren't just concert goers excited to see a famous rock band. They were a generation living in a world where doors remained locked, where certain words couldn't be spoken in public, where whispers were the only safe way to talk about the future. They were Brazilians living under military dictatorship, and they had come to see if Freddie Mercury understood what they needed from him tonight. It was March 20th, 1981. Brazil had been under military rule since 1964, 17 years of censorship, of disappearances, of people learning to smile politely while their thoughts remained carefully hidden. The dictatorship was beginning to loosen its grip, but slowly, grudgingly, and the men with guns still watched everything with cold, careful eyes. Queen had played Brazil before, but tonight felt different. The tension in the air was palpable, electric, dangerous. Freddie Mercury sat perfectly still in front of a small, cracked mirror mounted on the concrete wall. The mirror's imperfections distorted his reflection slightly, making him look fractured, uncertain. He wasn't looking at the rock star, the confident showman who commanded stadiums with a gesture. He was looking at the tired man beneath the kohl eyeliner and the carefully styled hair. His hands, usually so expressive, conducting invisible orchestras, punctuating sentences with dramatic flourishes, were resting flat on the makeshift dressing table. They were trembling, just slightly. A tremor he couldn't quite control, born of something deeper than stage fright. He was 34 years old. His appearance had evolved significantly from the long-haired, clean-shaven bohemian of Queen's early days. Now he wore his hair short, cropped close to his head in the style that would define the 1980s Freddie. His thick, dark mustache, the signature look that had become iconic, framed a mouth that was, for once, not smiling, not performing, just existing in quiet uncertainty. He wore a simple white tank top, his arms showing the lean muscle of someone who moved constantly on stage but ate irregularly on tour. His reflection showed exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes from weeks of traveling, from the weight of being Freddie Mercury every single night in cities across South America. There was a soft knock on the dressing room door, not the frantic beat of a stage manager announcing 5 minutes, but the slow, deliberate pulse of someone who knew the weight of the moment and wasn't rushing it. Brian May stepped in quietly. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood by the door, his homemade red special guitar slung over his shoulder like a piece of ancient armor, his signature, white curly hair catching the dim overhead light, his face showing concern that went deeper than pre-show nerves. "The air feels different tonight, Fred," Brian said softly. His voice carried the weariness of a long tour, weeks of buses and planes and hotels that all looked the same, and the wisdom of a man who saw the world in frequencies and vibrations, who understood that music wasn't just sound but communication on levels deeper than words. Freddie finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting Brian's in the cracked mirror's reflection. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of its usual theatrical flair. "The men in the hallway, they didn't look at me like I was a musician, Brian. They looked at me like I was a problem that needed to be solved." Earlier that evening, before the rest of the band had arrived at the stadium, A quiet official with a face like unread news had visited the dressing room. There had been no shouts, no dramatic threats, no obvious intimidation. Just a cold, polite suggestion delivered in careful English. Keep the performance simple. Do not encourage them. Do not give them ideas about what lies beyond these walls. You are guests in our country. We would prefer if you remained respectful. It was the kind of warning that felt heavier than any scream, the kind of silence that carried more threat than any raised voice. The official had smiled when he said it, a smile that never reached his eyes, and then he'd left, leaving behind a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. They're afraid of the noise, Freddie whispered now, standing up slowly from his chair. His movements were stiff, careful, as if his body carried weight that wasn't visible. He walked over to the small, barred window that looked out onto the stadium floor, looking at the sea of people through the iron bars of the stadium's inner sanctum. Even from here, he could see them, thousands upon thousands of faces in the gathering darkness, candles and lighters flickering like stars, creating a galaxy of hope and expectation. They think if we sing too loud, the walls might start to crack, Freddie continued, his breath fogging the glass slightly. Brian walked over, standing beside his friend, shoulder to shoulder, the way they'd stood countless times before in studios, on stages, during interviews, through triumphs and failures and everything in between. We could change the set, Brian said carefully, not suggesting but offering. We could keep it quiet, play the ballads, skip the anthems. No one would blame us, Fred. We've given them enough already. We've played here before. We don't have to be heroes tonight. Freddie turned to him, and for a moment the theatrical mask slipped entirely. This wasn't Freddie Mercury, rock star. This was Farouk Bulsara, the boy who had traveled across oceans fleeing revolution in Zanzibar, searching for a place where he belonged, where he could be himself without fear. Do you remember what my mother used to say, Brian? Freddie's voice was thick with a sudden, sharp nostalgia that caught them both off guard. About the light, Brian shook his head gently, encouraging him to continue. She said you don't bring a candle into a room for the candle's sake. You bring it for the people sitting in the dark. Freddie's eyes were bright now, glistening with emotion he rarely let show. She told me that when I was a child in Zanzibar, when I was afraid of the dark. She said even the smallest light matters when everything else is darkness. He looked back at the stadium, at the 100,000 flickering lights held by people who'd saved for months, sometimes years, just to be here tonight. People who lived in a world where they were told to be quiet every single day, where speaking the wrong words to the wrong person could mean losing your job, your freedom, sometimes your life. Look at them, Brian, Freddie said, his voice strengthening. Many of them saved for months just to be here. They live in a world where they are told to be quiet every single day at work, at home, in the streets. They've learned to swallow their words, to smile when they're angry, to hide what they really feel. He pressed his palm against the barred window. If I go out there and I am quiet too, then what was the point of any of this? If I'm afraid, I'm telling them they should be afraid too. And I can't do that, Brian, I won't. Brian reached out, a hand steadying on Freddie's shoulder. It was a gesture they had shared 1,000 times over the 13 years they'd known each other, a silent pact between two men who had built a kingdom out of nothing but dreams and stubbornness, and the belief that music could matter. They're not just here for the music tonight, are they? Brian said quietly. It wasn't really a question. No, Freddie said, his voice regaining its velvet strength, the tremor leaving his hands as purpose replaced fear. They're here to remember that they have a voice, that they exist as something more than what they're told to be. He turned to face Brian fully now, his eyes intense with conviction. My job isn't to be a star tonight, Brian. My job is to be the echo they aren't allowed to make. My job is to be loud enough that for a few hours they remember what it feels like to not whisper. He walked back to the dressing table and picked up his jacket, not the studded leather of a rebel, not the theatrical capes and costumes he sometimes wore. Tonight he chose something simpler, but somehow more defiant. A bright yellow jacket, cheerful and impossible to ignore, a splash of color in a country that had been gray for too long. As he put it on, he seemed to grow taller. The trembling in his hands vanished entirely as he found his purpose. This performance wasn't about ego anymore. It wasn't about being famous or selling records or proving Queen belonged among rock's elite. It was about a quiet, profound dignity, the dignity of being human, of being heard, of refusing to disappear just because someone with power wanted you quiet. The walk to the stage was silent. The corridors beneath Morumbi Stadium were narrow and poorly lit, concrete tunnels that felt more like a prison than a pathway to performance. Security guards, military police in plain clothes, their identities badly hidden, stood like statues along the route, their eyes cold and unblinking, their hands resting casually near weapons that were probably holstered beneath their jackets. Freddie walked past them, not with his usual theatrical strut, not with the exaggerated confidence he sometimes adopted to mask insecurity. Tonight he walked with the steady, measured pace of a man walking toward a profound duty, towards something that mattered more than safety or comfort. Roger Taylor and John Deacon fell into step beside him and Brian, the four members of Queen moving as a unit through the oppressive corridor. None of them spoke. The only sound was their footsteps echoing off concrete and the distant, muffled roar of 100,000 people waiting in the darkness above. As they reached the stairs leading up to the stage, Freddie paused. He could hear it clearly now, the low hum of 100,000 people breathing in unison, shifting in their seats, whispering to each other in Portuguese, creating a sound like ocean waves before a storm. It was the sound of a giant waiting to wake up. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and began climbing the stairs. When Freddie Mercury stepped out into the spotlight, the heat hit him like a physical force. Sao Paulo in March was summer's last gasp, humid, oppressive. The air so thick with moisture, it felt like breathing through cloth. The stage lights made it worse, turning the platform into a furnace. Within seconds, sweat was already forming on his skin. But the heat was nothing compared to the silence from the crowd. 100,000 people had stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped breathing. They were waiting to see if he would be the man they saw on the record covers, the fearless showman, the voice of impossible octaves and shameless confidence, or if the weight of the city, the weight of the watching officials, the weight of 17 years of dictatorship had finally crushed the song out of him. For a long moment, Freddie just stood there, looking out at the sea of faces barely visible beyond the lights. He could feel their collective held breath. He could feel the officials watching from the wings. He could feel history pressing down on this moment, demanding to know what he would choose. Then he walked to the piano. When Freddie Mercury stepped out into the spotlight, the heat hit him like a physical force. Sao Paulo in March was oppressive, humid air so thick it felt like breathing through cloth. The stage lights made it worse, turning the platform into a furnace. But the heat was nothing compared to the silence from the crowd. 100,000 people had stopped breathing. They were waiting to see if he would be the fearless showman from the record covers, or if the weight of dictatorship had finally crushed the song out of him. For a long moment, Freddie just stood there, looking out at the sea of faces barely visible beyond the lights. He could feel their collective held breath. He could feel the officials watching from the wings. He could feel history pressing down on this moment. Then he walked to the piano. He didn't start with a roar. He didn't launch into an anthem. Instead, he sat at the piano bench, adjusted the microphone with careful precision, and played a single delicate note. It hung in the humid air, fragile and clear, and impossibly brave. Then he began to sing not with aggression or theatrical bombast, but with a tenderness that felt like a conversation with every single person in that stadium. His voice, that impossible four-octave instrument, started soft and intimate, as if he were singing to one person in a quiet room rather than 100,000 in a stadium. He sang Love of My Life, a ballad, a gentle thing, a song about human connection stripped of politics or protest, just pure emotion rendered in melody. But in that context, in that moment, gentleness was radical. Vulnerability was revolutionary. To sing about love in a country where love had to hide from authorities, where being different or speaking truth could destroy you, that was its own form of courage. Halfway through the first verse, something extraordinary happened. The crowd began to sing with him, not shouting, not screaming, but singing 100,000 voices joining in quiet harmony, creating a wall of sound so beautiful and unexpected that Freddie's hands actually faltered on the piano keys for a moment. He looked up from the piano out into the darkness beyond the lights, and for the first time, he could see their faces clearly. Tears everywhere. Tears. Older men in the front rows, men who had lived through every year of the dictatorship, who had learned to bite their tongues and lower their eyes and accept that things would never change. They were weeping. Not because they were sad, but because someone was finally speaking the language of their hearts. Because for once, someone wasn't afraid. Well, the tension in the stadium began to shift. It wasn't a riot. It was something far more powerful. It was a release. Years of forced silence pouring out in song, in harmony, in the simple act of raising voices together without fear of consequence. Freddie felt it wash over him like a wave, their gratitude, their relief, their desperate need to be heard. And in that moment, he understood with perfect clarity why he had been born with this voice, why he had traveled this path, why he was standing on this stage in this city on this night. Not to be famous, not to be rich, not even to be loved, to be the echo that people who had been silenced could hear and recognize as their own voice, amplified and validated and proven real. He finished Love of My Life and stood from the piano. When he walked to center stage, he wasn't the shy man from the dressing room anymore. He was transformed not into a character, not into a performance, but into something more fundamental, into purpose made flesh. He leaned into the microphone, his eyes sweeping the horizon of faces, and when he spoke, his voice echoed with a gentle, fatherly warmth that carried to the furthest reaches of the stadium. "This one," he said in English, knowing many would understand, "is for the ones who have forgotten how to sing. Don't worry, I'll carry the tune for you tonight. But tomorrow," he paused meaningfully, "tomorrow you carry it yourselves." The roar that followed shook the stadium's foundations. For the next 2 hours, Freddie Mercury conducted a masterclass in controlled revolution. He didn't give overtly political speeches. He didn't wave flags or chant slogans. He didn't need to. He simply refused to be quiet. Every song became an anthem. Every gesture became defiance. Every moment of connection with the crowd became proof that they existed, that they mattered, that their voices, even when forced into whispers for 17 years, were still real and still powerful. "We Will Rock You" became 100,000 feet stamping in unison, creating thunder that the military police couldn't silence without silencing everyone. "We Are the Champions" became a collective declaration that survival itself was victory. Bohemian Rhapsody became 6 minutes of complexity and beauty in a world that demanded simplicity and silence. And through it all, Freddie gave everything. His voice soared and cracked and recovered. His body moved with the music, channeling energy that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human endurance. Sweat poured from him in rivers, soaking through his yellow jacket, plastering his short hair to his scalp. But he never faltered, never slowed, never gave them any less than everything he had. Because he knew they needed it, needed him to be fearless so they could remember what fearlessness felt like, needed him to be loud so they could remember the sound of their own voices. When the final note of the evening faded, the last chord of their encore hanging in the humid night air, there was no immediate explosion of applause. There was something better. There was a collective intake of breath, a moment where 100,000 people realized simultaneously that they were no longer alone, that they had just participated in something that couldn't be taken back, couldn't be erased, couldn't be silenced, no matter who wanted it quiet. They had been loud, together. And the world hadn't ended. The dictatorship's walls hadn't crumbled, but 100,000 people had just proven to themselves that the walls could be shaken.